Okay, good afternoon, or good second afternoon, or something like that. I'm Anne McCants, and I'm here from MIT, and I am incredibly grateful to the organizers for giving all of us, myself especially, the opportunity to be here. I know that this has already been said multiple times, but it bears repeating. So we are the stalwart few who are still struggling along to think about early modern financial systems. And we have been tasked in this roundtable this afternoon to speak about women and early finance markets, early modern financial markets. And so I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator and say a few things first, and then we'll follow yesterday's procedure, and we have a logical order, or something we hope will be a logical order, and then invite discussion with everyone. And I just wanted to start by saying that women have hardly been invisible, right, in our conversation for the past 2 days. But we know that in our sources, they're often rather invisible. And honestly, for much of financial history, and certainly the people who think about finance, not financial history, but just finance, women are largely invisible to them too, in the sense that they just don't think about it. And so part of our job is to think about women in particular, which is why there is this roundtable. And of course, we all know about the source problem, and we've had some very sort of clever runarounds for the source problem. But it seems to me there's actually an even more fundamental problem than just one of sources. And this is something I say to my students, if they're for the first time in a history class in particular. All of us have at some point, I think, in our lives said something along these lines. Boy, if I hadn't seen it, I would never have believed it. Right? We know that feeling. But it seems to me the problem often for the historian is the reverse. And that is, I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't believed it. And I say this actually in all seriousness, that our sources often only reveal to us what we are already capable of believing them possible of revealing. And that this may, in fact, be as deep a problem as, sort of the source problem for finding women in the first place. And I've been thinking a lot in my own work for many years, but especially lately, that about the status of women. And it really matters. I mean, not just socially, right, but very specifically it matters economically. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, we all know now from all kinds of business organization studies that the quality of workplace experience manages to improve for everyone if you put in some systems that are supposed to benefit women. Right? This is well documented. We know that gender equity is highly correlated with economic development, and we can argue about what comes first and so on and so forth, but the correlation seems to be very clear. We know that women's education promotes a range of clearly better child outcomes, health, education, social development, et cetera, right? And I could go on with this list. And I'm struck that the case studies that we've been talking about over the last 2 days are overwhelmingly from what I would call highly successful places. Scandinavia, Ontario, Canada, the Dutch Republic, France, right? These are places people want to live today. These are highly successful outcomes. And so one thing we might think is that women have to be core to this story. Even if we don't see it obviously, they must be because of what we know about the connections between gender equity, female development, female opportunities, and the kinds of outcomes that we like. That is to say, long life, prosperous consumerism, high education, stable governments, etc. And so if we believe that the women must be there because we see the outcomes, then I think it will be easier for us to see the evidence when it's in front of us. So that's how I wanted to start the roundtable today. I hope I haven't stepped on any of my colleagues' toes. And if you disagree with me, of course, feel free. So we're going to start with Martin.
Thank you, Anne. And I'm going to be talking about the project that I'm involved in together with Sofia and Tina, and which is headed by Elise Terminar, who sadly couldn't be with us today. The project that we're doing is also about, in the end, successful countries, but I hope that I can bring it into relevance for a global or at least European perspective. So our project is basically about women in the early modern and modern credit market, or to put it other ways, our project is about borrowing money in a time of transition, 1750 to 1910. We're doing this research because there is a lack of research on women's participation in credit activities, in a Scandinavian context at least, and at least looking on the credit networks. And also credit networks that has a very clear gender variable. That is what we bring to the table, I think. So we're doing samples from 1750, 1770, 1790, 1810, and so on until 1910 to get a generational development perspective. We're looking on 4 different places. We're using probates, and we're using what's most interesting to us is the end of all probates, because at the end of Swedish probates, that's where you see all the debtors and all the debts and claims that the decedent left. We're looking at Gävle, we're looking at Uppsala. Gävle is a bit north of here. Uppsala is also a bit north of here in Sweden. We're looking at Kristinestad and Lappfjärd, which are 2 towns in Ostrobothnia. They have Finnish names as well, but I'm not going to try to pronounce them out of respect for Tina and Sofia. I'm looking at Uppsala, university town. Sofia is looking at Gävle, a major export town, coastal export town. And Tina, you're looking at Kristinestad and Lappfjärd. So we're getting a lot of different perspectives here. We're getting town and rural perspective. We're having coastal and interior, well, somewhat interior-ish with Uppsala. We have a major trade town, Gävle. We have a major university town in Uppsala. We also have Sweden and Finland. So I'm not claiming that our project can compete with Joost Jonkers and the Gelderblom's project in the sense, but we are looking at Sweden and Finland were fully integrated in 1750, and then in 1809, 1808, 1809, they go their separate paths. Sweden as what we would call now a nation state, Finland as a part of the Russian composite state. So what we're doing is we're going to try to, how am I with time?
Oh, I wasn't paying attention.
All right, great.
Sorry.
So
I will start paying attention.
all right. So what we're looking at, we're trying to create credit networks, or we're trying to replicate credit networks by using these lists of claims and debt at the end of probates. So, you'll find table 1 in a lot of articles, also at this conference. And just to be clear, there's nothing wrong with those types of tables or graphs. We're trying to do figure number 2. We're trying to take the conversation into the next step. We're trying to map the social networks via credit. We're trying to map trust. And we're trying to map women's place in these credit networks. how well connected they are to the major players or not, how peripheral they are to the credit networks or not. We're interested in more than the promissory notes, mortgages, and as such. We're interested in also what is often unknown debts or smaller debts, apothecaries, doctors, the purchase of a dress or something like that. Because we are interested in also in the transition of the 19th century, which is in some ways a period of decreasing credit, in the sense that the supply of cash is increasing, so you don't necessarily need credit as much as the century goes on to buy stuff on a day-to-day basis. Also because insurances and social welfare policies are developing at this time. So we're trying to capture the development here with implementation of banks, life insurances, stocks and bonds, and we're trying to see how women dealt with that transition. Not because women per se, not because we're women historians, but because we find that being female is a very interesting variable. And and this especially for me, I'm very much interested in how people manage and circumvent and deal with structures and how they undermine or use them. Yeah, great. I think that's it.
Wonderful, thank you. So, Maria, do you want to speak from there or from here? From here, okay, and I promise I'll start paying attention to the time.
Okay. Yes, I want to say a couple of words first about women in financial markets. So the roles that we today know that women could have in financial markets. And then I'm going to say a little bit about how we can study credit law and tensions in credit law and get at women's role in credit markets by analyzing credit law. But first, let me say a couple of things about women's roles in credit markets. So I think we know today that women could hold the role as creditor, as debtor. Women were guarantors of loans. They were appraisers of value, and they were also brokers of loans. So let me say a couple of things about these 5 roles. So first of all, and very obviously, women functioned as creditors. If we look at elite women, at middle-class women, women with a lot of capital or some capital, it's very clear that they could make a living by lending out that capital. And I think particularly for women in the middle classes, where it could be difficult to find so-called respectable work, living off one's capital was very important. But also women at the sort of bottom of society, women working as domestic servants, were important, although perhaps involuntary creditors. Domestic servants often had to wait for their payment because employers just didn't pay them on time. So they were also creditors, but unwilling creditors. Debtors, I think Carol talked about the importance of deferred payments, and others have done that too. And I think to a very large extent it was wives and mothers who lent money for everyday goods and who benefited from these kinds of deferred, from the fact that they didn't have to pay immediately. Guarantors, the third role, I think that's really important, and that's something that we are increasingly realizing, that women were important as providers of security, or as it was said in the 17th and 18th centuries, caution. I don't know if you have that in other countries as well, but it was a special word used for security. And so that's a sort of indirect way in which women who had capital or who were regarded as reliable, so maybe sometimes that was enough to be regarded as a reliable person, they could act as guarantors for others who were not so reliable, who did not have so much capital themselves. Thirdly, appraisers of value. So in the credit markets that we are talking about in the early modern period, of course, loans were often secured with goods that were pawned. And for that to function, someone had to be able to appraise the value of those goods. And it's interesting to see that often the creditors, the borrowers, who had capital, they were men, but they were not able to appraise the value themselves. So they used women to appraise the value, to help them to decide how much it was safe to lend out on the basis of this particular good. And finally, brokers, they were women who did the sort of job that Philip Hoffman described French notaries doing earlier today. I think in all these 5 capacities, we know now that women were active, and that, of course, says a lot about economic agency, and it's a form of agency that is very important to take into account when we write economic history. So how am I on time? You have 2 minutes. Okay, so let me say a couple of words then about credit law, and because I think that's important to look at tensions inside credit law. Trust and transparency are 2 important issues when we discuss, that are often discussed in literature on credit markets. So credit markets are assumed to work only if borrowers and lenders trust each other. And transparency is something that is believed to promote trust. So if it is easy to check that a collateral is good, for instance, that is something that will promote trust and credit activity. Now, I think it is very important to remind ourselves that in the early modern period, credit could be forced. And Carol touched upon that in her address. And the example of domestic servants who involuntarily have to extend credit to their employers is an example of that. So I think it's important not to overstate or overemphasize the importance of trust. But certainly for private small-scale credit transactions, I think it's reasonable to assume that trust played a role. So therefore, it's interesting to look at how transparent the credit market was. And of course, debtors were members of households, and it mattered whether all household assets were at the disposal of the head of household, or if some members had separate and differentiated rights to the household assets. So whether wives had separate property, or if that property could be used as collateral for loans taken by the head of household, the husbands, I think that is something that is very important to observe. And same applies, of course, to the property of stepchildren. And now to take an example from late 17th century Sweden, credit legislation was changed in that period so as to increase transparency and trust in the credit market, and the means of attaining this goal was to make wives' property less separate, less well protected from the claims of the husband's creditors. So I think this illustrates how there were contradictory concerns about the need to protect women, wives, and the need to protect creditors. And I think these tensions that we can see in credit legislation and in how credit law was applied are very important to observe, because that too indirectly shows us the importance of women and men, and the fact that actors in the credit market were not neutral individuals. They were men, they were women, and they were all situated in a household context. Yeah, that's all.
So next we're going to hear from Tina, and do you want to just, from here? From here, okay. Excellent.
Hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me also in this panel, and it's an honor to be here, and it's great having all of you, my heroes, there in the audience and listening to us, me, and I'm able to speak. Oh my God. So first, Martin already told you about our project. So now I will firstly tell you about what I have done before this project, about my thesis. In my thesis that I finished 4 years ago, I studied freeholder peasants' credit relationships in 2 rural parishes, one in western Finland, where I come from, and the other was in the northern Sweden in the early 19th century. However, my task was not look for women as creditors and debtors, but as I collected the data, I am now able to look at it in a fresh way. So my main sources were also then probate inventories, and I looked at the creditors and the debtors that were listed in those documents. However, in freeholder peasants' probate inventories in that time in those parishes, I could not find so many women as a creditor or a debtor. Of course, there were many probate inventories that were made after women, but the problem, of course, is that the property that probates are describing belong to the married couple, not only to the deceased. Or actually, we are thinking about if there is something that would be personal property and not showing in the husband's or wife's probate inventory. But during that time, there were few unmarried women, and usually they didn't left any so huge estate worth probate records. So there are no. I didn't have any probate inventories after unmarried women because they usually get married. And there were some probate inventories after widows, but of course we cannot be sure how much those probate records describe the credit and debts of the married couple or the widow. I did make some results anyway. Yeah. My first result was that in those areas during that time, lending became more formal, as you might expect after this fabulous presentation today. In the sense that more and more often creditors lent against promissory note and interest. So the transition from informal to formal credit market clearly was going on there as well. The other observation was that freeholder peasants were usually in a credit relationship with their neighbors. And the loans were most often quite small. There were big loans as well, but the majority of the transactions were small. But I did not find women in the probate inventories. Now I have been thinking that maybe this is not still the whole truth. Women must have taken part in credit market, even though we cannot see them in those probate inventories. And we have thought if it's so that we cannot find women so often because of this household concept, could it be so that married women did take part in lending and borrowing networks, but in informal credit market, scribes usually wrote men's name on the lists of creditors and debtors, especially when we think about those freeholder peasants that lent to the neighbors. It would be weird if women did not take part in that kind of practices. Oh, thank you. Actually, the question is also when can we find women as an individual or men as individual creditor or debtor, when he or she is representing the household or themselves, during the formal market or also during informal market. And how, the other crucial question should be, we have been talking about informal and formal credit market today, it has been fabulous to listen, but how do we define informal market and formal market? Do we define it in a similar way? And are those definitions somehow hiding women? Are we able to see women when we are defining informal and formal? I also thought if it was a question about context, could it be different in towns? I was studying in my thesis rural areas, parishes. So as Martin already mentioned, I'm studying both town, small town and rural area next to the small town, and during same period of time. And we'll see if there are differences in town or rural area. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is going to be Christopher, and I think we have a pattern. We're coming up here. Okay.
Thank you. Yes. Hello. I'm Christopher Peel from the Department of History at Uppsala University. And I'm a trained historian, not an economist, and an early modernist. I think that's important to keep in mind when listening to what I have to say, when I'm speaking. Currently, I'm having a project about the early days of Riksens Bank, what later became Bank of Sweden. It was founded in 1668, that I suppose you all know. And I'm studying this early period from 68 to approximately 1721. And my main interest is not the big actors in the bank, but mostly which were the people that used the bank. Who were they? And why could they use the bank, and how did the bank trust them? How could the bank assess their creditworthiness in an early modern context, so to say? A little bit the same problems like the notaries in France, but in a bank in Sweden a couple of hundred years before. Because at least the preliminary results I think I can say is that the bank did it not only practicing inside the lending that we perhaps would expect, but it managed to extend credit to quite broad parts of, especially Stockholm, of the citizens of Stockholm in the late 17th centuries. But I'm quite new into this field of research about credit and women. Most of my career, before I started to studying Bank of Sweden, I've spent studying gender and work in the 16th century. But both work and credit are ways to make a living, I suppose you can all say, for both men and women in the early modern societies of Europe. And they were both what we quite anachronistically can call the labor market and the credit market, were surrounded by formal regulations and norms. And what I have seen so far is that both on the labor market and both the labor market and the credit market, regulations and norms was one thing, and practice was another thing. In many cases, we see quite big difference between norms, laws, and the practice on the market. And even among the actors, both the employees and the lenders in the Bank of Sweden this day, practice and law was not always the same thing. An example of this is that unmarried women could stand surety for loans taken from the bank. According to the Swedish law, as Anders talked about yesterday, these women were minor and should be represented by their male guardians. When they discussed this in the board of the bank, the senior officials of the bank, the senior servants of the banks, got criticized by the board of the bank. They were saying this is against the law, and trying to defend themselves, the senior servants said that these maids, these unmarried women, they have been adult, they have been up to the 40s and 50s, and are they really minor? We had a discussion about, because they are grown-up women and they are handling their economic activities themselves. And why could they don't? Why shouldn't we accept them as guarantors? I think this put the focus on an important thing to keep in mind when studying, especially when studying the early modern societies, that practice and law can be two different things. And I think also perhaps we should, I think among early modernists this is quite a self-evident idea, but I think we should also bring it more into the, when we are studying more modern credit markets. For example, in Anders' paper yesterday, when we saw all these single women in Stockholm, or at least these unmarried women perhaps acting at the credit market themselves, or with the, or if they were directed by the guardians. I think we can't, just looking at the laws and regulations, we can't be sure if they were acting themselves or if they were completely in the hands of the guardians. Yes, I think. Thanks.
You were much taller than I. Yes, so Liliane, come on up in here. Yeah, we can keep it a little lower.
I'm Liliana Allman, and I have worked with the credit market for some years now, at least 10 years. I worked in Gothenburg with the credit market there and the development during the 19th century, and I also have Stockholm, where I started to look for a couple of years ago from the consumer perspective, which meant that women pop up in a new way in the sources, because I couldn't just really use only the probate records. I also use small courts, I use bankruptcy records, and so on, and more sources to get to know what type of consumer credit were they, what could they use to consume, and then the business credits fell apart. But in the database I have both, so that doesn't matter for me. So I could turn it around again if I want. Yeah. So what I realize is, like Maria said, the legislation have changed what sources we are using. If they drop out from one sources because of the legislation, but they pop up in another sources. So that's.
And then to wrap up this set of introductory remarks, we're going to hear from Sophia, who's also, I should say, on Elise's project. So we've been trying to frame this discussion sort of, inside of that project, and maybe in part, in honor of Elise, who couldn't be with us. So Sophia's going to wrap us up, and then we're going to open it up to discussion. Oh, you're welcome to do that. Okay.
Well, I think everybody already said a lot of things.
Is it on? Wait, try one of those.
So actually a lot of the things I was thinking about has already been said, but even so, I would like to continue about the discussion about towns and countryside and say that I may be focusing completely on towns because I think they are showing a lot of a different context to us. And what's interesting about the towns and urbanization is, of course, the labor market and a diversified economy where women can do work that will rent cash in the households, working for others, have their small petty businesses, entrepreneurs, and that will provide them a possibility to become lenders, as Maria already showed. And I've been working with the city of Gävle, which is a port town. And that means that the occupational structure of a port town is somehow different from Uppsala, for example. I should also say that before that I was working with Helsinki, which is a Finnish port town as well, but it's also a huge naval base and the army is very present. So I completely agree with what was said yesterday, that you have to know the context, the occupational structures, and that will affect how women and men are behaving. And this also has to do with the fact that in port town, as in military towns, men are absent. They go away, they sail off for sea for years. Soldiers will be out fighting wars far away. And that means that women will be left as the sole providers. And here, to continue with the subject of single and married and who's actually alone, of course, unmarried women are not necessarily single. They can have partners, which is pretty common in the army. They are not always married, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a partner. The soldiers, I should say. There are also widows that are for some reason not remarrying. That doesn't mean that they are alone. And another factor is that even if you're a married woman, it doesn't mean that your husband is there. He can be away. And that means that you would have much more leverage. And even if the legal framework would say that you can do this and that, nobody else is doing it for you. So before I started with this project with the probate records, I also to some extent worked with court records. And these women will appear there, especially soldiers' wives are very active, because they don't really have a choice. So my contribution to what we can discuss further is maybe that even if, of course, there is the civil status determining what a woman can do, that will also always have to be put into context. Thank you.
Okay, we do have to get the microphones figured out. So maybe pass these down and try to... And we'll need one for the audience, I think. So what I was going to propose, I mean, what you've heard is really a number of projects that are not in initial stages, but still in early stages. And so this is a little bit different than the way our roundtable was yesterday, I think, where more of the commentators were looking back on sort of long and thoughtful careers. And here we're really looking forward to the kinds of nitty-gritty work that researchers might do in archives and how to strategize around the various problems that confront them. And so I think, unless there are some of you who would like to speak to each other, I'm inclined to open this up into a broader discussion around maybe two broad themes, sort of one of which is, what experience do all of us have that we can bring, especially to fairly, sort of projects that are still in their ground stages, but also what are the larger sort of methodological insights that we might bring to bear, right, as we actually go into the archives and try to make sense of the experience of women, which, as I said, I'm deeply convinced that these very successful cases, there's women all over the place. There are women all over the place. There, get my verb tenses straight here. But we're going to have to work a little harder to find them. And we're also going to have to make sense of the men that we do find and try to figure out when they're really themselves and when they are fictions. That the problem is both ways. Okay, so. Oh, excellent. Okay. All right. And I'm going to give you the first word and then maybe pass it around strategically.
Oh, it's nice getting the first word. So I want to thank you all for a very interesting discussion and wish you every success in your projects, because I think they sound fantastic. one of the things that I've learned in dealing with some of these issues, because I looked at stock markets and actual transfers of stock from a seller to a buyer, and you see gender. One of the issues that I would like you to, I think you might want to think about is how was some of this wealth, be it very small or somewhat larger, passed on? Because one of the things you see in the stock transfer records is a woman dies. She could be a single woman, she could be a widow, whatever. But what you see when you look at where do those stock go is that they're very often going to another woman. So it could be a niece, it could be a sister. And it may well be, it struck me in listening, especially about these women who are cohabitating, that this is one way that they can keep some control over assets, but then they have control to pass assets on, and I don't know what the will structure looks like if they made wills and if you can track them down. But the intergenerational nature of this, I think, is something that's important to consider.
Any of you want to respond to that in particular? Yeah.
I can say very often you see will from them. The women have wills, and they, just as you say, they transfer it to another woman.
Yeah.
And that's also when they have normal credits.
Yeah. So I think it's just important to think about that aspect, because we tend to not focus on it sometimes.
Thank you. Sorry. Just wait. Your time will come. Okay, well, thank you very much for all these comments, and I think we're going to have a very stimulating discussion based on them. If I might just offer a perspective from earlier times, from England in the 14th and 15th centuries, and pick up on this issue of the relationship between the law and practice, which I think several people mentioned is absolutely crucial in credit law. Sometimes, as Christopher was saying, there is a real gap between laws and norms on the one hand and practice on the other, but there can be times, and I think England 1200 to 1500 in the countryside is one of them, there can be times where practice follows law, and the implication of that in women, as far as women in credit are concerned, is that I believe married women are relatively conspicuous by their absence from participation in credit markets because of something called coverture, which is this crazy law or body of law which says that married women can have no independent legal identity, they cannot sue and be sued, they cannot contract debts. So the question then becomes, for medieval and early modern historians of women in credit, is did coverture have any impact on practice, or did married women just carry on and in actual everyday life gain independent access to credit, lending and borrowing on their own behalf, independently of their husbands, and disregard coverture? And I won't go into the details of why I believe this, but I think that the ideology that drove the law of coverture was deeply embedded in English society, both towns and countryside, and it had a real impact on what people actually did, because when it came to cases before courts, married women actually referred to the rules of coverture, cited it themselves, ordinary people in court, and used it as a defense to say why they should not answer debt obligations, or why they had no legal personage. And this trick, I believe, trickled through society and affected practice in various ways, which I can go into if necessary. But I'm just interested in what other, if I'm right and law could affect practice, then in what contexts was it the case that law and practice became disconnected, and the situation that Christopher was alluding to became the norm? So it may be something worth thinking about in these research projects that people are engaged in.
Christopher, do you want to actually address anything from that?
Yes. Does it work? No?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I can only say that's a really important comment from Christopher. I think, especially that you said in the end, and when do we see these separations, and how can we explain this? I think, at least for a Swedish case, I think we can say that every day the need to solve the problems of economic problems of every day, I think it was one driving force in this process. Because in the Swedish case, I have seen, at least from the small courts in Stockholm, that women arrive in the court and saying, and the courts are calling the women, and the women say, married women saying that I'm married, so my husband should be here instead. And the court say, no, you should be here. So it could differ.
Okay. I think maybe it goes on to,
okay.
Phil, and then Laurence?
Right.
Is it, okay.
Yeah. The previous question, plus something that Anne said, made me want to ask this. We have examples, the example from late medieval England being one of them, of subsequently successful societies that put severe constraints on what women could do. There are modern examples, China or India, which Japan, which are experiencing, well, China and India, rapid economic growth, but really severe, certainly constraints on women today and in the recent past. And so I wonder if you think of what's going on in Sweden in the 18th, 19th century. I mean, there are examples certainly in Central Europe, you believe Sheila Ogilvy, of just terrible constraints on what women could do in villages in the Czech Republic or neighboring parts of Austria. But are there, even at this time, in Sweden, for instance, severe constraints on what women could do? Yes, they could work, yes, they could borrow, but there are really limits on their free use of whatever money they borrow, or their ability to lend, or something like that. And it may necessitate, and this picks up on the remarks that several of you said, you may have to step out into other documents, for instance, besides the probate inventories, to court cases, for instance, or bankruptcies, to get a sense of what is really happening. And I wonder if you see any of that, and if not, maybe you keep your eyes open for it in the future.
Yeah, go ahead, Maria.
Does this work? No?
Yes, you are right about that. But I am so lucky I have worked with business, different kinds of business. So I have all this information already. So when I go down to my sources and start to look at, I already know these people, most of them. And that's why it's when I started to look from a consumer perspective, I started to see these women, which I know have bought this house at Norrmalm, together with some other woman, and sometimes together with a man or something. So for me, that wasn't the problem. But what I also saw from that they have another kind of network. Most women lend and borrow from other women's. And that you don't see if you don't know the business they are in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I think it's important to stress that this picture that Christopher conveyed, and I agree with him, which suggests that women in practice had a lot of leeway. that it is indeed, to a large extent, based on court records, not on the probate inventories. So it's how these court cases are handled in practice that constitutes the main evidence for this conclusion. But I think it's important to add something here, because otherwise we may end up with the impression that, well, you know, Sweden is all for women's equality today, and it was the same in the 17th century. So there's an important piece missing here in the discussion, and that is that land that had been inherited within the family line was very, very, there were very strict rules concerning that kind of land. So the rules that protected inherited land had as a sort of side effect that they also protected women when they owned inherited land. So I think that is one reason why courts were inclined to say what Christopher just quoted. Well, you're the right person to be here because this concerns inherited property, and then you are more relevant than your husband. And I think there was widespread acceptance in society of the importance of safeguarding kin property, and that sort of trumped the interest of husbands in relation to their wives. I think this is it's very important because because of course this was also could be a very misogynist society at times, but it was the fact that sometimes the protection of inherited property benefited women.
And I'm just going to add one piece, and then you'll have to be after Laurence. Okay. I mean, I think, Phil, first of all, these are matters of degree, not matters of perfection, right? And we have essentially all Scandinavian cases, right, on the panel, which is both fascinating and maybe in a way, you know, we've a small disservice, right? Because it would be good to have some other cultural context, but a kind of documentation that I don't think I've actually heard mentioned the entire conference yet, you know, are diaries and letters and, you know, fiction, if you will. And I think that we can learn a lot about the way women actually live their lives from, again, still more limited source material that they've left in writing. But I haven't really heard anyone speak about that. And I think some of the more powerful accounts we have, especially of subversion, right, come from not just from court cases, because obviously once something gets to court, you know, your subversion is possibly a kind of desperation, right, under the circumstances. But the kinds of everyday subversion that people who are either nominally or truly less powerful engage in. And so I think we need to think about the kinds of literary sources that might be available too. But Laurence?
Well, I'd like to share, because it's a way to give ideas, or at least to make, you know, contrast. The result of the study I did in the informal financial market in Paris in 18th century. And I could access this very informal, because it's very petty borrowings, through first petty delinquency. At a certain time, they decide that one is really cheating, and then everybody comes back and say, but I had this too, and I have this too, and then you have a whole list and behind that you understand how the stuff is functioning. And the second was, in Paris, we have the chance to have a man called Louis-Sébastien Mercier, who wrote something about Paris, and he's enlightened, but he described absolutely everything. And each time that there is archive, you can see that he's right. So to come to the conclusion was that it's a huge informal market, which is about cloth and stuff. It's a market with lots of brokers
one behind the other one, 3, 4 brokers in the time that you ask for money till the time that you get the money. You have 3 or 4 persons at least which are going to be behind, and each of them is making a little benefit out of the transaction, like any good banker today. And but what you see is that the women are always at the lower end of that brokerage. They're always the one who are dealing with the, most cheap stuff. And then I had the chance to look into an usurer, and we had his books. He lets 4 books, and he was a kind of accepting all kind of object, and he was a jeweler. But behind being a jeweler, he was a pawnbroker. And again, he has book in which he gives the name of the rings he's given to person to sell them back, because it's a both way kind of market. And always the cheapest watch, the cheapest ring were handled by women. So that's the first thing I would say. And then, and thanks to Louis-Sébastien Mercier, he described something which is, I think, very interesting about trust. And he explained that the women in the market, the one who are selling, herrings and peas and things like that, they need money to buy the merchandise. And there is one usurer who gather all those women in a room, and they have them, they ask for them collective trust. So the 16 women, and they promise, all of them, that they would pay for the one who's going to default. Mm-hmm. And this is very difficult to find. Mm-hmm. But, I don't see why not trust Louis-Sébastien Mercier when he described this. Mm-hmm. And this is interesting, too, on the ground that when Grameen Bank started in India, it started, now the bank has stopped doing that. Mm-hmm. But the first way they've started to have group of people doing these kind of things. Mm-hmm. And I'd like just to say last things to go behind what you said, law and practices. Because thanks to Montserrat, years ago, I was able to work in the archives of the bishop in Barcelona. Mm-hmm. And there I worked into files in which you had the bishop who had the right to undo the oath. And he was undoing the oath of many women who explained that they were forced to give their money to the husband for such and such transaction, and now that he's dead and they need the money, and they'd like him to release of the oath, which usually he did. And there is quite a lot of this kind of things for the 17th century, and the decrease in the 18th. So that's about all.
Fascinating. Yes. I think it would be nice if some of you could respond to the broad point that Laurence has made, but it's one we've heard over and over, that women may be involved, but they seem to so often be at the small end. And does that matter, right? I mean, what's the methodological implication of that? Is it better to be in at all? Or is it somehow an insult to be in only at the bottom end? Oh, Anne is dying to... Oh, you may frame it better, yes. Well, I don't know about that. But you need a microphone.
One of the things we know even today, if we look at wealth distributions, that the wealth distribution across women is further down the wealth chain. So I wouldn't say that they're coming in at the bottom, and is that right or wrong? I think women today and historically had less access to wealth. Mm-hmm. So where they can come into the market is going to be determined by that. And to me, the issue is then their agency, which is a different take on the point.
So, it's a glass half full or half empty question, right? Yeah. But do any of you have thoughts about this? It's going to impact your scholarship. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just actually found one of these pawnbrokers for the cities I study. And very obviously, a lot of his clients were women too. And they were pawning their old nightgowns or their flat irons. So it's obviously a very economy of the poor. But there I have to say that I study recruited soldiers and their family. So they are on the bottom, all of them, both men and women. But what's also interesting is that this is overlapping slightly with the black market and the illegal activities, that some of these women that are actually pawning and dealing with old clothes are also hiding stolen goods. And this is how I found them, because one of them is constantly appearing in court. And she's always very innocent. She had no idea that this was stolen. But there you see the chain of women, because she's getting it through some other woman who's been getting it from someone and who's been getting it from somebody else. And then, of course, the origin of these stolen goods would slowly disappear. But this is just really like the lower end of the strata, these women.
That there is, you know, and this I didn't speak about that, but you have also women and any kind of poor people, in fact, whose strategy to make a living is to enter into contraband and petty thief and stuff like that. And so we had in Paris at the time what we called revendeuses à la toilette, and they were dealing with the aristocrats who had to pay back. The only debt the aristocrat had to pay back were the debt of when they were playing games. You know, this is debts of honor. And then those women could access to them, and they would, you know, resell their beautiful fashion clothes to have them having money. So you had the strat, which was quite wealthy, a small one, but they were entering a kind of illegal, on top of being informal, illegal activity.
So, Hakan, do you want to jump back in now?
Yes, thank you very much. We have discussed a lot. We all agree that women took a substantial part in the credit market. And then comes the question, if we want to know more about that, we think it is so, what material and what methods are the best or maybe most fruitful? And I think the discussion, we haven't reached that discussion yet. We have mentioned the court material, which I think is more important maybe than probate records, if you use them for single years, as you do in your project. There is a very good dissertation in Uppsala for some years. What's her name? Eller Hinnemo in Stockholm? No, Uppsala too. No. Your department? Yes. Ah, good. Very interesting. Yes, because she looked at court material and how it actually functioned in reality. And that is a very important when we discuss rules in relation to common sense. You had common sense also in her dissertation, a lot of it. And if you take the network analysis, I think it stops in a way to see that, well, there is a small nod for women, 1, 2, 3, 4 women, because that's what you see in the probate records. There could be a widow or a minor or so on. But if you take this for a longer period, then you can see the system, how it works. And that's what I talked about, the cultural thing in Uppsala. Help me, the kulturgeografen there. Karin Nibor, yes, I have forgotten her name too. I forgot everything nowadays. It's a wonderful dissertation actually, because she follows the probate records from, let's say, 1815 up to 1850, and looks at all these debts and assets which actually is in the probate. And she has a system. It's it's one parish actually, but she finds very good connections and what was important in the local context. I think that could be a way to look behind the numbers, which we want to do actually.
Okay. So Joost, is there a microphone up there? Oh, okay.
Yes, I'd like to add one dimension, and that's notably from the source side, and this is something we've been doing in the Netherlands in a different project, Oscar and I, over the last year or so. And I heartily recommend you to start digging around for the scrapbooks or the notebooks with household expenses. So we've been collecting them through, we canvassed the public to hand them in. We have about 4,000 of them at the moment, and there are still more of them lying in family and local archives. And that's where you see that who holds the reins of household expenses is the women. And they have far more handling of money than the men. So some of the households we have both men and the women that do them. But they have far more frequency of using money, and using money in very different senses. And that is something you can make out of these particular sources. And I find them, in using them, a very important complement to the court records and the probates, because you see there actually day-to-day what they're doing with their money. You can sometimes also see where they take credit or do not take credit, because some of the accounts are settled weekly, monthly, or even on an annual basis. And that is where you see the actual traffic. So do not look too much for nodes in credit networks or agents in particular senses, but what women do and provide as a very vital function on a day-to-day basis from those scrapbooks of household expenses.
Do any of you know, are such sources available in the Swedish materials or Scandinavian? Yes? Any of you use them?
When on inns, for instance, they have these records, and there's a woman, and sometimes she's writing something from a dream or whatever, and then a customer comes in and she writes down what they bought and so on. So you can get some information about it and how they deal with the transaction. But I think they are very hard to get from the cities.
Okay. So it does seem like an excellent suggestion, though, to think about. Okay, so Anders and then Carol.
Yes, thank you. I was a little depressed a few moments ago when you claimed that the Agency of Women, it's on the lower part of the list. It's not so important. But I would like to remember everyone that the multiplicity of limited wealth matters. By the simple fact that women are more than men. In Stockholm, for example, they were 2/3 of the adult population. So it doesn't matter if a single person is not that wealthy or influential or whatever, but combined as a group, they are extremely important. They are at least 10-15% of the economy. That's not unimportant, I think. And of course, the key word to the solution, or what we should do, however, we do love probate inventories, but source pluralism is what it's called for. It's very common among us ethnologists, for example. And Elin Hinnemo is at the moment doing a pilot project investigating the Stockholm City Chamber of Guardians to look into it closer and find research questions and so on. And I will myself dig quite much deeper into that material as a complement to probate inventory.
So it strikes me, actually, that this is a really important point, and that one of the very distinctive things about European urbanization, and I'm thinking, all the way back to, Jan de Vries's book on European urbanization. Was that in the 80s? It was a long time ago. That they are so heavily female, and whatever the rules may be, if there's a group of people who are, demographically dominant in a community, they're going to be working. They're not going to be idle, and they're going to be developing networks. And so it's our job to figure out what those are, but that they simply have to be there, whether they sort of show up in the formal rules, right, or not. So, Carol, unless anyone, you wait, okay. Go ahead, Carol.
Just sort of building on the comments that have just been made, even if you don't have great records, other kinds of records, you do want to know the population at risk, basically. That means, you know, how many women are in the population. And I think that's something that you're pretty strong on in Sweden, right? It's a demographic record. So that's very important to know, whatever area you're looking at, how many women are there, and you know, what the age distribution is, and whether they're married or not, or widowed, their marital status, and that's important because of the way the law is written almost everywhere. And certainly, unless Sweden is vastly different than any other place on earth, women, particularly unmarried women, are going to, whether they're widowed or single, are going to gravitate towards towns and urban areas. Finally, another relatively easy source as you move in, certainly by the 19th century, but probably in the 18th century, is evidence about women's signatory ability, so that you have some idea if what their situation is as far as having certain kinds of skills that can, you know, place them above others. Because in many marriages, women were as smart, or, you know, just figure randomly, they're going to be as smart or smarter than their husbands. But if they don't have, they've already got the law against them. Yeah.
You can have the floor next.
I said could be. I didn't say.
Oh, thank you.
See, most of you don't have this problem here. Bring along your partner. Anyway, so you know, if you're trying to get at this whole question of women's agency, in fact, we know they have a lot more agency than you see in the law, because you know within household dynamics. But trying to figure out an indicator for that is kind of hard sometimes.
Right.
And there, Dan, do you want to say something?
No.
Maria had wanted to respond.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to get back to what Chris said about coverture being a reality in medieval England, and is there a difference as compared to Sweden, where the law courts seem to, you know, make little of what the law said? I think it's important here to stress that the Swedish judiciary, until, well, at least until the 19th century, was not a very professionalized system. So lay influence was huge. So it was basically laymen, ordinary townspeople, ordinary peasants who sat on these courts. And I think that's important to bear in mind. My impression is that in England, the judiciary was professionalized and sort of much more learned earlier on. So that may account for this difference. But then my understanding from Amy Eriksson's work is that in England, this very rigid system it turned out to be a problem, that it's good in a society and in an economy if it's possible to make exceptions, to you know, find new institutional solutions that will allow even married women under coverture to act as if they were not under coverture, and that is something that is an important driving force when it comes to understanding new legal institutions in the English case. So I think that there are huge differences in many ways between the English and the Swedish case, but at the bottom, the problems that the law has and economic life has to grapple with are essentially the same, but the solutions may vary. Yeah.
Right. Which was a point that Phil made this morning, right? That the constraints for certain kinds of lending may be, you know, broadly universal, but the possible range of solutions can actually be quite large, as long as they really are solutions. Any other comments? Francisco, do you have yeah, there we go, okay.
Yes, thank you. I would like to show my gratitude for the group, and also Elise is not here because she gave me the opportunity to write about this issue of women and credit during my dissertation. And I want to add some variables which is important already we're talking about. I think with demography, inheritance regime, because it changed a lot. And when you talk about soldiers, it happened the same with migration. If the man is not at home, you will be more able to be accepted as an intermediary in economic terms because you need them. It's the same case of necessity we are talking about. And I'm not 100% agree with the point of the women are only dealing in the lower levels. I think that is true in general, but it's also about publicity. As far as we go in credit markets to a higher publicity degree, registration, also alphabetization is a fact. And finally, I found a lot of businesswomen on my region. I don't know if, I know that Galicia is not Sweden, but it's also privileged by demography and inheritance regime. But the biggest grain importer in the late 18th century of Santiago was a woman. One of the biggest gold and silver importer of Coruña was a woman, which is an important business because they manage with the king, with the mint, with the highest rank, and also is this grain importer right to the king. And I think it's more about how we are dealing with history and with sources, rather than the real history of economics. And this is my opinion, but maybe I'm connected to a particular region again, a particular framework. But.
Anne, did you want to? While it's there.
I did want to ask, but I wanted to ask something of Joost, because what I heard him say when he was talking about his household daybooks was that I thought I heard him say that they were crowdsourced. They put out a call for them. And that's what I wanted to ask him.
Was he really saying that with crowdsourced?
Well, he has strategically
he's left the room,
so that he does not have to answer this question.
I know they've been doing some crowdsourcing, but I think his point was that a call to all the local history places helps one find them as opposed to having to go look for them. But I was waiting, and he's gone.
This crowdsourcing has been used in other fields. It was used to study, to source letters from migrants who left Germany for the United States, and it was very successful in the 19th century.
And I only raise it because the statement from the panel was going to look for it, and I think he was giving you a shortcut. But we can ask him. But if it's been done, if it's been done for letters, you can do it for household diaries. I think he'll be back.
Are there any other comments? And okay, Tony. And if not, I was going to raise yet another issue, but I'll hold off.
I guess I was going to raise another issue too. So you can tell me to be quiet if you don't want to address this. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done just to try and include women in the picture, which I think is a really valuable thing to do. But presumably histories that don't include women are very limited histories because we don't include, half of the productive population. So presumably then if you add women to a history, it should make the big picture look a little bit different. And I was just curious, I know that most of you are at the beginning of your projects, but whether what you've done so far kind of hints at how looking at women in credit might actually change how we think about credit in its different manifestations.
It's an excellent question. Any takers on an answer?
Sorry, it's a really big one.
No, that's great one, and I think actually exactly as you you told, and I think even though we don't find the names of women in the list of creditors and debtors, at least we have to think about it. When we think about why there are no women, why don't we find women there? We ask different questions and explain where the men are. There we can see only men, and then we find explanations why women we can't see and women were there. But I don't know. This is something that I have been thinking about. We need good questions, and women is a good question in credit market. Yeah.
Any of the rest of you want to say anything on that? Jos, while you were away, the question was raised. Did you put out a public call for the? Okay. On radio and television. You didn't tweet it?
Someone must have done, but I don't.
Okay.
We were overwhelmed with response.
Okay. So just for the sake of the microphone, they were overwhelmed with response, which is good news. So put out your calls for things from people's attics, right? I think that's the idea here. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, it's just a comment following on from Tony's question and thinking back a long time ago to the article I wrote on actually women in debt litigation, but obviously dealing with credit networks in England. And one thing that came out from that, looking at diaries, which have been mentioned as a source, is how often women are talked about as much better moderators than men, you know, in a gender aspect. And I guess, can we find this in other cultures? Is it specifically early modern sort of thing? But that's one thing that you can tell from looking at the sources, which you won't get from probate inventories or court records, that they were certainly valued in these diaries. You know, there are other people in society, like the local vicar or whatever, who are supposed to have these roles, but this definitely came out. So just observation there.
I mean, this seems very consistent to me with Maria's observation that, you know, when you actually have to value goods and assess the quality of something, you know, more often than not, you brought in a woman because she would be the more reliable source. I think in part because she had more knowledge, but also maybe also because she was considered to be, you know, more moderate, that is to say, judicious in her judgments. Go ahead, and then I'm going to get the last word.
I was going to say just another, maybe another kind of application of my question would be, are there methodologies that arise from finding women which require a lot of creativity that can be applied, you know, more broadly? And so that might be another way of kind of thinking about expanding to a bigger picture.
Okay, well, I guess I just wanted to add one more piece that I think that we all need to think about, and that is our economic well-being in this world does not just depend on our access or use of money per se. We have other kinds of credit, and I think. Well, just like we have other kinds of capital, now we call human capital, and I think for especially the societies that we have been primarily focusing on here, I think that even when there are legal restrictions, there are broad sort of cultural opportunities, be they religious enthusiasms, earlier and greater access to literacy. Networks, right? The kinds of things that could potentially go into Martin's drawing, but not just for promissory notes, but for other kinds of lending and borrowing, and that activities that are not expressly financial, but are still lending and borrowing and networking. Women, I think, are often quite powerful in these settings. And that this is a big part of the story that is very difficult for us to capture. Right? And I think part of what we need to do to bring to bring women back in is to recognize the importance of those things. And I think this really speaks to your broader question, Tawny, that, you know, if we do that, it reminds us that that should actually be an important part of men's history too. And that at least in settings where there are legal restrictions, one of the ways that you circumvent them is by being a better networker, right? And so I certainly don't believe that, you know, women are genetically better networkers, you know, or evolutionarily or whatever. But I do believe from reading historical sources and living an actual life that women rely on networking more often than men, and I think it's a runaround. But it's a powerful runaround in many settings, and it's one that we should take more seriously and try to figure out how to find that in our sources as well. So, to all of you, thank you so much, and best wishes. I feel like these are projects really on the cusp. And to all of you for the great suggestions. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe we have to stretch our legs for 5 minutes.